Okay. A Rose for Ecclesiastes. Oh, that's bad reflection. That's better. By Roger Zelazny. This is not a novel. This is for novellas. Oh, by the way, look at that gorgeous cover. 1969. The artwork, fabulous. Absolutely amazing. I'm envious of the artist who made this. Okay, so 4 novellas. The first one is The Furies. The second is The Graveyard Heart. The third is The Doors of His Faiths, The Lamps of His Mouth. And the fourth is the title, Rose For Ecclesiastes. There's a magnificent introduction by Theodore Sturgeon. It is complex, erudite. I needed to reread bits of it to get what he was getting at, but that's Theodore Sturgeon for you. In it, he claims that he'd never met Zelazny, but he seems to be as impressed by Zelazny's writing as I ever have been. He actually says there's never been anything like Zelazny in the science fiction field. And then he goes on. He makes a few interesting points here, actually. So he says more and more science fiction is produced and not being called science fiction and paid for heartily, which I gather is a bugbear of his. And he mentions On the Beach, Dr. Strangelove, 7 Days in May, 1984, etc., etc. I haven't read 7 Days in May. I haven't even heard of it, to be honest. But I've read the other ones. And then he makes a few other points about styles of writing. So this comes across more as an essay written by an author about writing styles. He talks about writers who are best at writing people. They're people persons. They write their characters so well that he feels sometimes they overlook the need for plot and structure. I call them people experts, those especially gifted to create memorable characters, something more than real ones, etc., etc. He also describes another type of writing which, when I read it, reminded me very much about the other book I'm reading at the moment, or I'm listening to it as an audiobook. Genuine prose poets we have seen, but quite often they fail when the measures of pace and structure are applied. And we have certainly had great storytellers whose narrative architecture is solidly based, soundly built, and well braced, clear to tout it. But more often than not, this is done completely with a homogenized, nuts and bolts kind of prose. I wonder if you can guess which book I'm listening to on audiobook that applies to, I think, very, very much. Go ahead, make a guess. I'll probably be reviewing that book in a week or two at this rate. Very famous one. There won't be a single person who reads science fiction and fantasy who hasn't heard of it. It's epic fantasy. There's probably not a single person in the world at the moment, at least in the technological world, who doesn't know a show based on it. That's a solid hint for you. Okay, he makes some excellent other points, and I like the way he compares Zelazny's writing style with mythology. Here, I'll read a bit more. First, Zelazny's stories are fabulous. I use this word in a special and absolutely accurate sense. Aesop, that would be Aesop of Aesop's Fables, did not intend to convey a factual account of an improbably vegetarian fox equipped with speech and with human value judgments concerning a bunch of unreachable grapes. He was saying something else and something larger than what he said. And it has come to me over the years that the greatness of literature and the importance of literary entities lies in this fabulous quality. One could almost call them, may ponderously call them Jungian archetypes. Just read a book about Jung. That worked for me. But one recognizes them and or their situational predicaments in one's own daily contacts with the landlord, the employer, and one's friends and family. He mentions some literary entities that he feels fall into this archetypal, essential storytelling. He mentions Captain Ahab, Hamlet, Job, Uriah Heep, and basically what he's trying to get at there is that Zelazny writes stories in which the characters are so archetypal that it doesn't really matter the context in which they're being written. It's more that they're going to matter to you because of the archetype they're representing. But he also makes the point that Zelazny writes amazingly beautiful books that are well constructed. He does. These are novellas. I am one of those people that no one approves of anymore. I don't like short stories. They're just not my thing. They're over too fast. I read terrifyingly fast at times. I can finish a book in a couple of hours if I've got nothing to distract me. A short story is barely worth picking up a novel for. They're over too fast, and if you read a short story and it's 5 seconds later it's gone, and you've got reading time allocated, what are you going to do? You're going to read the next short story, and before you know it, you've read half a dozen of them, and they all bleed together in your mind, and the essence of the short story is lost because they're just blended together into mush. Zelazny is not like that. Because they're novellas, they take more than 5 seconds to read. I'm going to make a really strong effort to pause and do things in between reading. I'll read one, then I'll do something else for a while instead of going straight on to the next one, which is always my problem with short stories. I always want to go straight on. So, the introduction by Theodore Sturgeon is awesome. He sums up by saying okay, I'll just read it out. I have not said, sum up all the thoughts and feelings I hold concerning the works of Roger Zelazny, past and to come. Sum up what has struck me at each of the peaks of all of his narratives, and without fail, so far, at that regretful moment, when I have turned down the last page of any and all of them. Sum up all this in one word, which is grateful. I think that's adorable. I really do. So, I have just finished the first novella from this gorgeous collection, Rose For Ecclesiastes, Roger Zelazny. The first novella is called The Furies, and it's about 3 characters in a far future universe, all of whom have a special power, who then track down an intergalactic, if you please, fugitive. There's a lot tongue-in-cheek about it too, starting with the names. We introduce to each single one of them first. One of them basically has a degenerative muscular condition and is crippled, by which he is crippled, but he's got a phenomenal ability to memorize occupied planets, cities, and everything about a planet, and he can identify in seconds from a photograph where that photograph was taken. So that character is called Sandor. With the names, you get a strong tongue-in-cheek element, and this whole novella feels a little bit as if it's quirky. It feels a little bit as if Zelazny was writing it from a sense of humor, as if he was making a joke almost at the person reading its expense. I'm not sure. The humor is so subtle, it's hard to pinpoint. Normally an author putting humor into his story or his novella is going to do it one of a number of ways. Zelazny does something else, so it feels humorful and playful, but it also feels odd. Odd is the only word I can give. Read one and find out for yourself. Read The Furies. It's pretty good. So Sandor was when he was 4 years old, he could already name all the 149 inhabited worlds in the galaxy. And that's the first character. The second one is Benedict. The two are spelled slightly different. He's spelled Benedick, so that's Benedict. And he is a bit of a second part of his name. He is what do they call? Do they call him paranormal? He's got a special way he describes them, doesn't he? Anyway, his ability is that if he shakes your hand, he knows everything about you, which is slightly terrifying. When I was a kid, the idea of someone who could touch my hand and know all of my deepest secrets was probably one of the most horrific things I could imagine. But he can also triangulate the location and the vision of a person of surface thoughts from an object that he's touched. The third one is called Lynx. They're spelled differently. He is an XICI in agent, which stands for Interstellar Central Intelligence, and he was an assassin. He's now found Religion of the Flame, which is, it's interesting. Every single one of these characters gets 1 or 2 pages maybe dedicated to creating them as a character, and I have rarely seen characters built so solidly, so fleshed out, so rich. Every single one of them has a richness of existence that I've got to tell you, a lot of books that I've read haven't managed to achieve for a single character in 200 or 300 pages. I'm looking at you, Sarah J. Maas. I'm looking at you. So these characters are brought together by the ICA, the Interstellar Central Intelligence, in order to track down and kill Victor Corgo, who is the captain of the Wallaby. He used to be a captain in the service of the Guardsmen until he turned upon humanity after humanity had destroyed a whole species on a planet. They wanted to turn that planet into inhabited human planet. To do that, they wanted to move the natives out to a nice reservation world. So what you've got is this novella of 51 pages that has got more in it than the whole series can. These 3 characters try to track down Victor Corgo. They do that a few times. The Guardsmen keep trying to burn him. He keeps escaping. There are some amazing themes in here. One of the themes is that Victor Corgo was burned. His heart was taken out of him and replaced by a metal heart. The original heart is actually what Benedict uses to track him. Yeah, I could rave on about this one for a long time. It's incredibly rich. It's got a sad ending. The triumvirate of Furies manages to achieve their purpose, but by then you have got more than a bit of sympathy for Captain Victor Corgo, and the people who are destroyed with him. I feel that Zelazny is making a strong commentary upon who a real victim and who a real offender is here, and it's very subtle. I really enjoyed this novella. On to the next. After a break, I will take a break, then I will go on to the next, so they don't mush together in my mind. So just finished the second book in Rose For Ecclesiastes. The second one is called The Graveyard Heart. And what it's about is probably what it's about is humanity, let's face it. The background for it is the party set. The party set was conceived by a woman who was born in the 1800s, but then when she was about 80, cryogenic freezing came in. She froze herself and then froze other people who applied. They sleep in bunkers. They are the party set because they awake to go to these fabulous, expensive, lush parties all the way around the world. And that's pretty much all they wake up for. So their Christmas party is the most notorious Christmas party on Earth. They are always expensive. They're always dramatic. They're places like the moon, orbiting space stations. Because actually before what it's described as on the back of the book is the graveyard heart, awaking periodically from their absolute zero beds. The near mortal set pass the centuries in a round of orgiastic parties, while ordinary humanity ages and dies. Orgiastic parties here is the version of, when was this? The 60s. So we're not talking about orgies and we're not talking about sex. We're talking about expensive parties with amazing food, amazing costumes, amazing locations. Words change over time. That one has. So, based on the Eternal Party theme, you kind of think this is going to be a bit light, a bit fluffy. It's going to be like influencer or an Instagrammer maybe who spends their whole time at party locations. Nope. Wrong. This is dark. It is eerie. It is scary in many, many ways. And it is deeply insightful at the same time as being beautifully written, because it's Roger Zelazny and he writes beautifully. I'll read a small bit from it and then go on. The going was slow, and he wound his way through the cold wilderness. After a period of near panic, when he felt surrounded by trees and had to backtrack, he emerged into the starlit clearing where menaces of shrubbery dappled the broken buildings with patterns of darkness, moving restlessly as the winds shifted. That's an example of Zelazny's writing, and that's an example of the underlying tone of this really, really amazing novella. It starts in the far, far distant future when the moon already is occupied and we've got manned satellites in the sky. It's 1999. I love it when science fiction does this. The far, far future of technology in 1999. The world's about to tick over to 2000, and our protagonist, Alvin Moore, has gone to a party. He's a successful engineer. He isn't a member of the party set. He's finally made enough wealth to be able to afford a wife. In his mind, he needed to make money before he got married. This isn't a particularly sexist book, and the dynamics of the sexes haven't aged in here, by the way. Quite dramatically haven't aged when you compare it to other authors like Asimov or Heinlein, where the women are 1950s caricatures. It's not the same here. Alvin's gone to this party because, having looked around and decided that he wanted to get married, he checked the options, and he of course selected the most unobtainable woman in the multiverse. Her name is Leota, though he calls her Lorelei sometimes. There's a lot of reference in this volume in general to classic mythology characters, as you see in the first story, The Furies. So Leota is the one he's decided he wants to marry. He manages to get an invitation to one of the parties, the set parties, even though it's fabulously expensive, and he goes to meet her. The party ends, she goes into sleep for the next however many months, and the next time he sees her is 2 years later for him, and he spent those 2 years learning to dance well, speak French, which she speaks, polish up on the social niceties in order to impress her more, which she is impressed more. She says, "You dance better than you did last night," because for her, it's the next night. That's all they do. They sleep and then they wake and they go to parties. Moore, as he's called in the novel, not using his first name much, is fascinating. And that's part of the atmosphere of scariness I think that you get about this novel. He decides that he wants Leota for no apparent reason. In order to get her, he has to join the set. So he decides to do all these things to join the set, which are the sort of things that most people desire to achieve in their own right. Most people want to be wealthy. He knows he has to be wealthy in order to be in the set, so he achieves that. He knows that he has to be notable, so he becomes an inventor, patents all these inventions, and becomes a notable scientist. His goals are to do these things. These goals, for most people, are the goal. For him, they're goals in order to get into the set, which he achieves in the end. And the scene in which he finally has to finally go in for an interview with the woman who first started the set back in the early 1900s. It would have been. It's now in the early 2000s because it took him a few years to achieve his goals. She is an amazing character, and the scene in which he is interviewed by her, like most of the scenes in this book, are glorious and a tiny bit scary and a true reflection of the weirdness that humanity can get. She wants people who will be in the set, because the set are basically the celebrities of the future. They're followed every moment of their waking life. They're photographed. They're well known. They are basically Zelazny's prediction about how influencers and celebrities are gonna be. And he can't say he's entirely wrong. The mechanism's different, but he's got humanity's need to focus on people who aren't real and who are glittering and outside humanity. He certainly nailed that in here. Anyway, so Alvin Moore achieves his goal. He joins the set. After he joins the set, he realizes that while he's done all this stuff to get Leota, now that he's there, she isn't his goal anymore. He now wants to be part of the set, which she is, and they sort of are on again, off again partners, one gathers, for their weeks and months, but our decades. Until finally, he keeps asking her to leave, marry him, have a life, have a child. She doesn't want to. She wants to stay with the set. Eventually, she decides, for reasons that were never really given, that she wants a child, and she's told that she's going to be kicked out of the set. She succeeds to adjust to the notion, and she and Alvin both decide to leave the set. I'm not going to tell you what happens next, because what happens next is really creepy, crawly, scary. And then at the end of that, Alvin finds himself having to confront the future that he's leaving into with no comprehension of how it works. So that is also done very well. Now this story is approximately twice as long as the first story was. I think this one's about, I don't know, maybe 60, 70 pages. The amount that's chocked into that is phenomenal. Every sentence seems to serve several different purposes. The overall mapping of the story, there's not a lot of story plot line there, but in terms of what's packed into it, it's immense. And it's very, very impactful, because despite the party set and the cryogenic freezing and all the rest of it, basically this is about the weirdness of humanity, where it's dark and it's strange and it's eerie and creepy. So, second story out of Rose For Ecclesiastes, The Graveyard Heart. I'm going to be going on to the third one as soon as I have refreshed my reading mojo. Did you notice that bit in the cover where you've got the face peering out from the rose? Beautiful artwork. Just finished the third story from this, I say story, I mean novella obviously, from this book, The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth. This apparently is a Nebula award-winning saga, and I have read it before and I've always enjoyed it. My enjoyment of it is very marine focused, and I don't think I've read it recently. So this is meant to be a saga of monster fishing in the treacherous seas of Venus, where the bait is human. That's what it says on the back of the book. I find these descriptions all to be a little bit dry and a little bit uninspiring, to be honest. What I've always loved about this novella is that, yes, it starts on Venus, and yes, they are hunting a monster, a great leviathan, not a dwarf minke whale. They're not leviathans. But so in the massive oceans of Venus, and you've got me right there, I wish Venus had massive purple oceans. It sounds fabulous and I want to visit them. I want to sail them. I want to scuba dive them. It's not going to happen because what we know of Venus these days is that's not how it looks. We start with a protagonist who's living on Venus and has obviously had maritime experience. There is a particular vessel that's been built specifically to catch these leviathans. It's called 10 Square. And it's first person narration, and you only slowly learn who the narrator is from context. I really like the way that's done. I thought it was interesting. So he's talked into being bateman, as they call it, on a new expedition to try and find this massive marine monster. Just looking for the name of it. I'd like to find the name of it. So what a bateman does, we find out, is that they send a hook down, and it's basically hollow cables. The bait is actually not the human, the bait is a glowing pink floaty thing, but for some reason they can't hook up the illumination from the surface, so they have to send a scuba diver down to do it. Any marine themed science fiction is automatically my jam, so this is obviously one that I love. There's a fair bit of scuba. I wish that Roger Zelazny hadn't called fins flippers, because flipper is a dolphin and fins is what scuba divers wear, but you know, can't have everything. When he was writing this, I think scuba was a new term. I think they mostly called it skin diving out in the world. So the name of the beastie that they're hunting is Ichthyoform Leviosaurus levianthus, generally known as Icky, predictably. I really like that. I really like the development of the dynamic of the protagonist. The protagonist isn't the one funding this expedition. It's being funded by a wealthy woman who's a cosmetics entrepreneur. We gather that he knew her in the past. This ichthyoform has never been successfully caught. There have been a couple of attempts that came close, but usually ended in destruction and general injury and devastation. Again, you've got the most beautiful writing, and an example of that is going to be here. The guy is talking to the protagonist and he says, "I've heard the stories about you both. So you're a heel and a goof off, and she's a bitch. That's called compatibility these days. I dare you, bateman. Try keeping something you catch." I think that's gorgeous. I mean, there's nothing about Zelazny's writing that I don't think is gorgeous, honestly, except maybe the flippers. They're definitely fins. This is a flipper. What you put on your hand is a fin. Actually, that's a pectoral fin, but never mind. Aside. So there's not really a twist to this story. There's a slow reveal of relationships and experiences, and I'm not going to tell you whether they catch Icky or not, because in a fairly major extent that's incidental to the story. The wonderful thing about the story is the journey and the narration. I love the descriptions of diving under the hull of 10 Square. I love the way it describes the propellers, or the rotors I think they call them, as a hazard to scuba divers. They don't mention the bends, but this is an old story, so it might be that the bends weren't well understood back in whenever this was published. 67? Oh no. 67, we already knew about the bends. Anyway, they're not mentioned here. It's a grand story. Anyone who likes science fiction with a marine theme should go out of their way to go hunting for the doors of his face, the lamps of his mouth. Anyone who likes classic sci-fi, remember this is a Nebula award-winning story, novella. Nebula award-winning novella. And for people who just enjoy good writing for its own sake and want a short sci-fi, thoroughly recommend it. It's brilliant. A Rose for Ecclesiastes. I have just finished the final novella in this gorgeous, gorgeous collection. It is the title the novel A Rose for Ecclesiastes. What it says about it on the back is this. The Martian race was dying until a 6'6" poet from Earth brought them a rose without roots, a book of sorrow, and a message he didn't believe himself. Yes, all that's true, but like all the descriptions for all the novellas on the back of this book, they all seem a little bit dry, a little bit concise, and a little bit under-talented compared to the novella that they're actually describing. So when Theodore Sturgeon wrote the introduction to this, he claimed that the stories got better and better. A Rose for Ecclesiastes is the last one. It was his favourite. It's not mine, I've got to admit. I really enjoyed the doors of his face, the lamps of his mouth better. That one completely got me. And in terms of social commentary and deep-seated cynicism and eeriness, I think The Graveyard Heart is better. A Rose for Ecclesiastes is set on Mars. Like many other authors of the time, this is from 96. There was a fascination with Mars, so you saw Ray Bradbury in The Martian Chronicles, you saw Mars in Heinlein's universe. Zelazny is kind of the same. His poet, who is the main character at one point, makes a reference to someone seeing the canals on Mars and assuming that there was a civilization, so he got it right but for the wrong reasons. That's never really explained any further, but I'm guessing that it might mean that even when this was written, Zelazny already knew that the canals were probably a natural structure and not created by any sort of civilization, which is what we now believe to be the case. With that said, there is actually a civilization on Mars, and this book is odd because this race is represented as being human. Not quite human, they don't look quite the same, they don't sound quite the same, but they're human for a couple of reasons. And I feel that Zelazny did this in order to make a point, and the point is kind of religious and messianic. Now, there aren't a lot of Martians, and our 6'6" poet, which I'm not quite sure why the 6'6" is a big deal, but I'm hazy on what measurement a foot really is anyway. So he is along on this expedition. Initially when I read this, I thought there was actually a Mars colony, but by the end of it, I believe it's just a ship that has gone to Mars as a Ford type expedition. There's one group of Martians living near where the ship lands, and there is a linguist who has made contact with them. I forget her name, doesn't much matter. And she organized with the matriarch of the Martian clan to allow the poet in because he's an amazing linguist. He's a natural learner of languages. He's a poet. He's won many awards. He's poeted for many years, I guess. But his real talent is learning languages. Apparently he knew 5 or 6 by the time he was a teenager. He was brought up by a father who was a preacher of the heavier kind of religion, some form of Christianity it's never really gone into. So he learned all the scriptures as well, knows the Old Testament, knows the New Testament, can speak Aramaic as well as Hebrew, as well as Greek, as well as everything. He spent a couple of years in India, so he could now talk Sanskrit and Hindustani. He talks any language he ever encountered, basically. So having arranged for him to meet the matriarch, he is invited into the temple to read their holy documents, because their holy documents are the history of the race as well as their religion. And he does that, and he learns both their normal language and their high language, which hadn't previously, no one had been aware that there even were 2 languages. And he starts transcribing these books. It turns out, I'm massively spoilering this one, but whatever. So it turns out that the Martians are dying out. Eventually, toward the end, and this is definitely a spoiler, he kind of finds out through reading an old history that a rain came from the sky, but instead of being a nourishing rain, it was a rain of death. And after that rain had fallen, all the children who were born were sterile. He then finds out that these somewhat people-like people, I mean, there's no doubt that they're people, but humans, it's suggested they're not. So these non-human people, there's one that looks like a very young girl. Turns out she must be well over 200-300 years old, as he estimates it. They end up having an affair, which is judged harshly by his commander. And turns out from that affair that the men may have been sterile, but the women, they aren't, and genetically are compatible with humans. As a scientist, Zelazny, I'm sorry, but you and I have got issues on that one. I find it very hard to get past that. It makes no sense. Unless you're a coral, two species don't produce viable offspring. Anyway, never mind. I can get past that. I'm better than that. I can deal. This race have decided, based on the teachings of their own prophets, that they are destined to die. And the poet puts together a whole heap of arguments that include transcribing part of Ecclesiastes into their high language and preaching his own preachings and writing his own poem. He managed to convince them that their doctrine of Lokar being their original prophet, is incorrect, and he preaches them into believing that they can continue to live, that his child inside this alien is going to be allowed to survive. They won't accept their death. They will fight on. And the problem here is that he's doing it for love of this female, and he doesn't actually believe in any religion. He's not what you'd call a confessed atheist or agnostic. He just really doesn't care. He sees no numinous quality in the universe that isn't humanity, and he isn't particularly interested. He likes writing poetry. He's described as an arrogant, unfriendly man by his crewmates when he finds them talking about them, and he doesn't care. He really just doesn't like people. But he fell for this particular alien girl called Braxa, and he gets the botanist on the ship to create a rose, and he brings them a rose. They have no flowers on Mars. So that's the combination of the rose with no roots, the Book of Sorrow being his translation of Ecclesiastes, and he translated that specifically because their prophet of Lokar and something in Ecclesiastes, which isn't a book I know terribly well, both of these two prophecies say that it's the end of humanity, it's the end of all times, and he goes, no, we ignored that and we kept on living and we're still here all these years later, and you can do that too. And he convinces them, despite having no belief in any sort of prophecy whatsoever. They've accepted him as their alternate prophet or Messiah or something like that, and he gets on the ship and goes back, leaving behind this Braxa entity who he finds at the end, spoiler, that she came to his bed and to him basically because it was her duty, not because she loved him. That was one part of her duty that she never managed to achieve, but she did get pregnant, thus ensuring the survival of the race. It's a weird sort of story. There's a lot of beauty to it. There's a fair amount of poetry. There's a lot of poetry in all of these stories, actually, except for Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth, the Nebula award-winning saga, and also my favourite. I like poetry. I don't know what this says about me. But the Furies has some poetry. The Graveyard Heart has a huge amount of poetry, including a bad guy who's a poet. And A Rose for Ecclesiastes has a main protagonist who's something of an anti-hero and a poet. So there's a lot of poetry in there. It's commentary on humanity. It's definitely a commentary on religions and prophets and prophecies and how reliable they could be. And I think what he's getting at there is it doesn't have to be true, and the prophet doesn't have to believe, and it can be meaningful without having an innate reality. I think what he's getting at here is that the meaning is in the person hearing the message. The meaning doesn't have to have a material reality outside of the listener and the believer, because the poet never believes any of his own prophecies, and he never believes in any sort of religion. He's just trying to get them not to kill his beloved. So yes, it's a dark and bitter kind of a story, but in honesty, while I didn't love every second of reading it the way I loved every second of reading the previous two, it certainly made me think a lot more. The Doors of His Face, The Lamps of His Mouth, really enjoyed that. Loved every second of reading it. Enjoyed The Graveyard Heart significantly. The Furies was just funny. But A Rose for Ecclesiastes has definitely stayed with me past the reading ending. I've been thinking it over and turning it over in my mind. Keep trying to triangulate, come at the meaning from different points of view. So maybe that's what Theodore Sturgeon loves best, and maybe that's why it's his favourite story, but I can't necessarily disagree with him, though I'm not going to go so far as agreeing either. Anyway, very glad that I've finally reread this gorgeous novel. This gorgeous collection of 4 novellas. I think it's been a very long time since I've read it, based on how little I remembered a lot of it. Very glad to be rereading so much old science fiction. Very grateful that YouTube channel has given me motivation for doing so and for reviewing them. So yes, like, comment, subscribe. Talk to me about classic sci-fi.